9 through 11. So that's why I picked it. And hopefully what we're doing is we're trying to recognize that Paul's writings are difficult to understand. Paul's writing style in that first century Greco-Roman rhetoric was very dense, very detailed, and by modern day standards, difficult to read. In Paul's day, it was an oral society, an oral culture, so all the more flowery and the more detailed and the denser your speech, apparently, the more notable you were as a speaker. But by today's standards, if you were to write like Paul and submit a report to a college professor, I think you would get that report back, and the comments on the report might be something like, you might want to tighten up your writing a little bit. Something like, the main theme is getting lost in too many details. So you may want to redo your report. Something like, you might want to trim out some of that secondary material. That would be a modern day assessment if you were to write a report the way Paul writes. And another one, these are very important points, but some things are competing for primacy. You've got some stuff in your writing that is competing with the main thing. So you may want to read out. So that's kind of what I'm helping you do. What we want to do as we read Paul today in chapter 11 is to find the parts of the text that are concrete and objective, and suspend our understanding of part of Paul's writings that are cryptic. Cryptic, and I don't know if you realize this or not, but Paul invents brand new words sometimes. That's how far Paul goes with his liberty. Now, we know that the Holy Spirit was guiding Paul, but there are things that make Paul's writing difficult to understand. So today, we're going to try to do that. We're going to try to just identify in chapter 11, what's the blue line backbone? What's the main thing? And what are the other rhetorical devices that Paul is using that are really secondary? These other devices are being used to support the main theme. And what we find today, a lot of times, it's the supporting texts that get all the attention, and they're there to support the main thing. And yet they steal all the attention away from the main thing. So that's what we want to identify today. Let me briefly run back over what we've done so far. This is an oversimplification of it, but here it is. Romans chapter 9 focused on God. That first century predicament that the Jewish Christians found themselves, specifically in Rome, very unique circumstance. I'm going to get into detail about that. What was the Jewish situation in Rome where Paul writes the letter to? So he's writing about that, and the first thing he says, chapter 9, is focusing on God. Is God to blame? Has God failed? Is God not keeping promises to Israel? Is all this God's fault? That was chapter 9. Chapter 10, the camera focuses and it pans away, and now the camera focuses on Israel. And chapter 10 specifically puts the culpability, the blame, specifically on Israel, and explains how Israel has always been divided into two groups: the nation as a whole and the remnant of people that are saved. So the focus is on Israel. Today, in Romans chapter 11, the camera is going to pan over and focus directly on Gentiles. And that has a huge amount to do with how we interpret Romans chapter 11. The focus is on the Gentiles. What Paul wants the Gentiles to understand It's really a warning. In fact, I would label this sermon, chapter 11, a warning label for the Gentiles. Paul is going to warn the Gentiles because it looks like they could make a mistake based on what the Gentiles are witnessing, the Jewish Christians in Rome. Now that's still a little cryptic, so by the end of the sermon, we're going to explain all of that. So let's start and let's find the main thing in this chapter. And it starts out, part of our blue line backbone, Paul's main theme starts out in verse 1. I ask then, has God rejected His people? By no means. And move on down to verse 2. God has not rejected His people. Can you figure out what the theme is there? Twice, emphatically, Paul is making it known God is not rejecting Israel. Why would he say that? Because that's coming right off of the heels of chapter 10. And in the end, chapter 10, Paul said, God says all day long, I hold out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. That was where he left off in chapter 10. God is holding out His hands. Israel is rebelling. So now in chapter 11, he opens by saying, so is God going to reject Israel because of their rebellion, because of their stiff-necked hard-heartedness? Does God reject them as a people? Emphatically, Paul says no. Even though they make him work overtime, he's not giving up on them. That's going to be the entire premise of chapter 11. Paul is going to warn the Gentiles against misunderstanding what is going on with Israel. The question is, what we want to know is, why is Paul having to prove to the Gentile Christians that God is not rejecting Israel? What's happening? That's called the historical context of Romans chapter 11. What's going on that Paul has to warn the Gentiles and tell the Gentile Christians, hey, God is not rejecting His people? And that's what we want to find out by the end of the sermon. So there's his little blue line opening, and immediately he breaks into one of his typical rhetorical devices, and it's called a katina. Katina is the technical term for a chain of scriptures. Paul is going to chain together a group of scriptures to show that God doesn't give up on His people. So everything we read in verses 2 to verses 10 is there to support the idea that God doesn't give up on His people. His main thesis in verses 1 and 2. So even though the katina stretches across verses 2 through 10, I want to set up the fact that Israel, historically, in Paul's writing and throughout the Old Testament, Israel has always been divided into two groups. Earlier, Paul already said, not all Israel is really Israel. So here are some statements that will bear out historical scrutiny. Here are some statements that are true throughout all time. In Israel, there has always been the nation of Israel and another group called the remnant. There's the whole and there's the remnant. Throughout history, there has been those who stumble in Israel, and there are those who believe. In Israel, there are those who break covenant with God, and there are those who are covenant keepers. Two groups of people. Historically, The Bible talks about in Israel there are those who will find their sanctuary in God. And there are those who will be broken by God. So there is no one catch-all phrase for the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel has always historically been divided into two groups. Those who obey covenant, those who break covenant. So his quotes are going to have to do with that. So the first quote he gives is going to be in verses 2 through 6. In verses 2 through 6, he's quoting and arguing 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19 is going to be the story of Elijah and the 7,000. So, in 1 Kings 19, Elijah feels defeated. Elijah is lamenting Israel's rebellion as a nation. Their rebellion as a nation has been made evident because they're killing all of God's prophets. They're worshiping the false gods. And now Elijah is on the run because they're trying to kill me too. And from Elijah's perspective, it looks like all of Israel is done for. All of Israel is in rebellion, and God, I'm the only guy that's left. And what God is going to show him is, no, Elijah, it looks that way to you, but I have 7,000 Israelites that I'm saving for myself. So Elijah teaches us the story of how things look is not always how things are. So we'll read this scenario. Elijah's on the run, and he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars, they've killed your prophets with the sword, and I only am left. And they seek my life to take it away. Verse 17. And there's a little break there. God goes on to comfort Elijah, and he's going to basically tell them, yeah, I'm going to destroy a lot of Israel, the ones that are in rebellion, but I have a remnant that I'm going to protect. So here he goes, verse 17. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu will put to death. And the one who escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all of the knees that have not bowed down to Baal. So you can see why Paul would use this story, because he's dealing with the same scenario in his day. In Elijah's time, Elijah, like the Gentiles, looked around and thought it's hopeless. All of Israel is falling. All of Israel is in rebellion. There's no hope. Destruction is the only thing I can see. But God has to reveal to him, yes, Elijah, my wrath is on Israel and destruction is coming, but I am not completely rejecting all of Israel. I have a little remnant that I'm protecting. I have 7,000 Israelites that I'm protecting. So it looks hopeless, but it's not. Don't be deceived by what your eyes see. He goes on from there. The second quote in Romans chapter 11, verses 7 through 8, he's going to be quoting Isaiah chapters 28 and 29. If a person doesn't go back and find out who Paul is quoting and why he's quoting them, then you're just going to break with Paul's methodology. Paul is supporting his main thesis in verses 1 and 2, and he's using these Old Testament references to support that thesis. So what's happening in Isaiah 28 and 29? Isaiah 28 and 29 are part of a larger section. Isaiah, the actual section, is Isaiah 28 to 33. That's the block of text that a person might want to understand. But let me just tell you what Paul is referring to. In Isaiah chapter 28, it looks like things are hopeless for Israel. Here's the outer appearances again. In Isaiah 28, roughly verses 1 through 13, Isaiah is seeing a hopeless situation. The northern 10 tribes of Israel in verses 1 through 13 are mocking God's prophets, saying that all of your prophets are just speaking nonsense. They're just speaking gibberish. All of God's commandments for Israel sound like gibberish. You should go talk to little babies instead of us. And God gets angry. And He says, oh, my commandments are gibberish to you. Tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring in a foreign nation whose language really will sound like gibberish to you, and they are going to bring destruction on you. So, northern 10 tribes are destroyed by the Assyrians. The visual here is, it looks hopeless for Israel. You move on in Isaiah 28 to verses 14 to 22, roughly. Now he's talking to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is doing the same mistake that the northern 10 tribes made. Jerusalem is ignoring God's covenant, ignoring God's commandments. And so at the end there, roughly verse 22, that section ends with something like a decree of destruction is planned for Jerusalem. So again, Paul is referring to another situation where the visual in the nation looks hopeless. Has God rejected Israel? Is God giving up on Israel? He has destroyed and eliminated the northern 10 tribes, and now He has planned destruction for the southern 2 tribes. He's planning destruction for Jerusalem. Is God rejecting Israel? Do you see why Paul is using these texts? And then ultimately at the end of chapter 28, like verses 23 and the end, there's a strange poem about a farmer. A farmer knows how to till up the soil, but he doesn't till up the soil forever. He only tills it up for a little while, and then after he's tilled the soil, he goes and he plants brand new seeds and reaps a brand new harvest. The purpose of that is God saying, I'm not going to destroy you forever. I'm not going to be breaking up the soil forever. I'm only going to do it for a period of time so that I can get rid of what's not working and I can plant brand new seeds and then give my favor back to Israel once again. That's the purpose of chapter 28. Paul quotes 29, and in 29, the scene jumps forward. The scene jumps forward, and he says, at some point in the future, all of your enemies, all the bad stuff that's happened to Israel is just going to seem like a distant dream. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to exalt you. I'm going to favor you. And all the bad stuff that's happening right now is going to seem like a distant memory. So after God's wrath, after the cleansing, after the destruction, I'm going to return back to my people and I'm going to plant and grow them once again. But in the meantime, he says, so he fast forwarded, now he comes back to their present day in Jerusalem. In the meantime, you guys are worshiping me. You have a zeal for me, but you're worshiping me with your lips. You're worshiping me with your words only. But your heart is far from me. Therefore, and that's where Paul is quoting. Let me give you the verse. Therefore, here's what I'm going to do. Isaiah 29 and verse 10. For the Lord has poured out upon you a spirit of deep sleep, And He has closed your eyes, which is the prophets, and He has covered your heads, which is the seers. What God is doing to Israel, because they are falsely worshiping with their mouth, but they don't love and obey God from the heart. God says, therefore, I'm going to remove perception. I'm going to remove my prophets. I'm going to remove the seers. In other words, a terrifying event is going to happen to Israel temporarily. I'm going to take away all of your spiritual discernment. And that is a consequence of you breaking covenant faithfulness with your God. Covenant faithfulness. You won't have prophets. You won't have seers. You won't have any spiritual direction or insight. And this is cause and effect. Because you've broken covenant with me. I'm holding a court case. I'm finding you guilty. And the penalty for breach of contract, the penalty is that I remove my presence from you. And when God removes His presence from a people, there's no more protection. There's no more rain. There's no more crops. There's no more safety from their enemies. And that's exactly what this is. God acts with Israel on a covenant basis, and it's cause and effect. If you rebel and reject me, if you violate the terms of the covenant, then I'll remove myself from you and destruction is going to sweep in and sweep over you. But if you keep covenant with me, then the blessings will follow you. And Israel is always divided into those two camps. Those that are washed away and destructed for breach of contract, and those that are exalted and blessed for their faithfulness and their allegiance. Quote number 3 goes Romans chapter 11, verses 9 through 10. Paul is quoting Psalm 69. And you'd have to be familiar with what Psalm 69 is. Psalm 69 is called an imprecatory prayer. An imprecatory prayer. Difficult to understand by our standards, but an imprecatory prayer, if you were to read one, it can sound very harsh. You're like, how could a good Jew want that? How could a Christian want that? An imprecatory prayer is someone crying out, God, they're violating the covenant. Hold court, find them guilty, and deliver the punishment for breach of contract. That's what an imprecatory prayer is. It's not wishing harm on somebody. It's saying, God, here are people that are rebelling and being unfaithful. Hold court, find them guilty, and issue the appropriate judgment. And when you break God's covenant, the appropriate judgment is always something terrible, because when God removes His safety and protection from you, you become susceptible to all of the elements. That is the nature of covenant. That is the nature of the Old Testament. And that's what Paul quotes. So in the imprecatory prayer, what's interesting is when we look at David's prayer, David is seeing the Messiah, and he's seeing Israel rejecting their Messiah. And he is praying, Lord, let your judgment and your wrath come on these people, because they are breaking covenant with you. They're rejecting your Messiah. They're not obeying your righteousness. Look at how David prays this. Psalm 69 and verse 21. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink. Let their own table before them become a snare, and when they are at peace, let it become a trap. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and make their loins tremble continually. This is judicial language. This is not revenge. This is not vengeance. This is judicial language. God, hold court, recognize that they are breaking covenant, find them guilty, and dole out the appropriate punishment. That's what that suggests. Now, in verses 13 through 24 of Romans 11, Paul uses another rhetorical technique. He's going to create a metaphor. He's going to create a metaphor about a branch that has natural branches. Some of those natural branches get cut off, and other branches that aren't natural get grafted in. But be careful, because if that new branch that gets grafted in is in breach of contract, disobeys the Lord, then the new branch can also be cut off. And if the old branch that was already cut off repents and begins obeying the Lord, then God can put the old branch back into the vine. That's the metaphor. What in the world does it mean? I have simplified it for you, and I've taken out all of the extra detail that makes you miss the blue line backbone. So what I've given you here on your sheets there, verses 13 through 23, is only the blue line important backbone of what Paul is trying to say. Verse 13. Now I am speaking to you Gentiles. You want to put a square around that? That's the backbone of the chapter. I'm aiming all of this information at you Gentile Christians in Rome. Why? We'll find out in just a little bit when I give you the background. So I'm speaking to you Gentiles, verse 18. Do not be arrogant towards the branches, meaning towards Jewish Christians, the natural branches. Verse 20. Do not become proud, but fear. Verse 21, because neither will God spare you. He's being hard on the Gentile Christians. He's saying it's a warning for Gentile Christians. You guys be careful how you handle this moment in time. Verse 22, look, God's kindness is towards you. But if, eon, you need to circle that if. In the Greek, that if is a huge grammatical pointer. Aeon. Aeon is a conditional statement. It's letting you know, I'm setting up a condition. This is where the judicial process comes in. This is where the court is held. Aeon, if you continue in His kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. Let me finish. Sorry, guys. Verse 23. And even they, if, aeon, you got to circle that if, aeon, E-A-N. If, here's a conditional statement, if they do not continue in their unbelief, they will be grafted back in. Those two verses, 22 and 23, and those conditional statements put the Gentile Christians on the same ground that they are witnessing Jewish Christians be on. Paul is looking squarely at the Gentile Christians and saying, you are on the exact same footing as the Jewish Christians. If they reject Messiah, they'll be cut off. If they turn around and accept Messiah, they'll be added back in. And if you misunderstand the situation and get arrogant and get proud and begin rejecting Jewish Christians, you too could be cut off. So Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians are on the exact same ground. Why is Paul having to drive that point home? What are the Gentiles doing that is forcing Paul to drive home this point? By the way, let me just give this to you. This is some grammatical stuff, but verse 22, if you continue. Myself, I would put a circle around if and draw a line to the word continue. The word continue is a verb. In the Greek, it's in the subjunctive. Subjunctive means you might or you might not. Very important grammatical insight to the text. This is a conditional statement. You might do this or you might not do this. So there's no predestination involved. There's no things have already been decided and this is the way it's going to be into perpetuity. No one is safe. Right now you're in if, conditional statement, and the verb is if you continue. Some of you might, some of you might not. And then he says the exact same conditional statement in verse 23. And even they, the Jews, if, put a circle around if, and draw a line over to continue. If they do not continue, subjunctive again, they might turn around from their rebellion, is what he's saying. Or some of them might continue in their rebellion. So all of this is cause-effect. Your status, your relationship in the kingdom of heaven depends on what you do. Obedience to the gospel or a rejection of the gospel. That right there gives you a ton of insight. But the clear warning then is for the Gentiles, and we don't want to lose sight of that. The focus and the weight of chapter 11 is warning the Gentiles on what they are, how they are reading the current situation in Rome with Jewish Christians. Don't make a mistake. Don't misread what's happening. Don't become arrogant or proud, because you're not safe either. So the tone of chapter 11 is very preventative. Why is he warning the Gentiles? And for that, we'll put a pause in our outline of the chapter, and let me just give you some background information as to what is happening and why Paul is having to warn the Gentiles about misreading the current moment that they're living through. The letter is going to Rome. Paul is writing the letter from Corinth. Here are some events that we'll want to recognize. In 49 AD, Emperor Claudius kicks all the Jews out of Rome. It would be good to know that, because that has a bearing on why Paul is writing the letter to Rome. In 49 AD, the Emperor Claudius kicks all the Jews out of Rome, and we know this through Roman history. Suetonius, a Roman historian, when he writes about the life of the Emperor Claudius, he writes the following: since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, Claudius, expelled them from Rome. Roman historical, documented in Roman history, 49 AD, Chrestus is the Latin rendering of Christ, Messiah. Christ is the Greek, Messiah is the Hebrew, Chrestus is the Latin. So, the Jews in Rome were causing such a problem with Christians. That the Roman emperor, it was so big that the Roman emperor kicked all the Jews out of Rome. That's a major effect. 49 AD, 19 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. Just 19 years later, Rome is having to make laws and kicking people out of Rome because this Jesus story is wreaking havoc in our country. So he kicks out the Jews, 49 AD. What's fascinating about this is about the same time Paul is in Corinth, and the Bible tells us that Paul meets Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth. And the Bible says Priscilla and Aquila were Romans that had been kicked out of Rome because of Claudius. The Bible is confirming, corroborating what Suetonius wrote in history. Let me show it to you. Acts chapter 19, verses 1 and 2. After this, Paul left Athens, and he went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So when Paul writes the letter to the church in Rome, how does Paul know what's going on in Rome? Because he meets two Christians that had just been kicked out of Rome. So, they had just come from Rome. So this must have been roughly 49 AD. He meets Aquila and Priscilla, and they're filling Paul in on what's going on in Rome. 49 AD, 5 years later, Claudius the emperor dies, and he gets replaced by Nero. Nero will be the last emperor in that dynasty, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero is the last emperor. Let's see, you start with Julius Caesar's son, Augustus, the first emperor. From Augustus, we go to Tiberius. From Tiberius, you go to Caligula. Ooh, I'm not sure if it's Caligula or Claudius. Two C's right next to each other. Caligula and Claudius. Yeah, Caligula was first. Claudius was next. Nero is next, and that's the end of that dynasty. After Nero, Rome begins to fall apart and fracture. That was called a parenthetical. I just got way off the subject. Sorry, guys. See what happens when you get off the topic. Okay. Why was Paul having to address a warning to the Gentiles? So, in 54, 5 years after the Jews had been kicked out of Rome, in 54, Claudius dies, Nero takes over, and Nero is looking for money because he wants to rebuild Rome. So what better way to get money than to bring in a whole new tax base? And that's what he does. He tells all the Jews to come back to Rome to build up his tax base. These people pay taxes. I want them back. When Paul learns that Jews are now allowed to go back to Rome, Paul wants to go to Rome because he wants to go to Spain to teach the gospel. And now that Nero is allowing Jews to come to Rome, Paul is planning a trip. Seems like I forgot something in here. Let me remember here something, guys. Paul had finished up 10 years of evangelizing from Jerusalem all the way to Macedonia, and Paul said, there's no more place for me to evangelize around here. I want to go to Spain, and now that the road is open to Rome, I'm going to go to Rome first, and he writes Rome this letter. In 56 AD, Paul is writing to the church in Rome. So 49, Jews are kicked out. 54, they're allowed back. 56, Paul writes the letter. Now, what Paul is addressing is what happened from 49 to 54. 5 years where the Jewish Christians were kicked out of Rome. For 5 years in Rome, the Christian church is purely Gentile. Only Gentile members in the church in Rome for 5 years. And this completely changes the look and the face of the church. The Christian church becomes Gentile. It looks like God has done away with the Jewish presence. And so now Gentile Christians had filled all the leadership positions in the Roman churches. The Christian church now looked Gentile. And it looked to the Gentiles like God no longer favored the Jews. They were in danger of reading the situation wrong, just like Elijah read the situation wrong. And they were in danger of becoming proud and arrogant, thinking to themselves, we are now the elect. We are now God's people. And the Jews are just a footnote in history. That's what was happening to the Gentile church in Rome. And Paul writes this chapter 11 to correct that. Says, don't make that mistake. God is not rejecting Israel. God still has a remnant in Israel. Let me put a pin in the story again, guys. There's so much information. I'm trying to be precise so I don't lose you, but let me discuss the situation with Jews in that first century. Paul went on his missionary journeys, and we know from Paul's own account, when he says that Jesus appeared after the resurrection, he appeared to this person, this person, this person, and he appeared to 500 people all at once. We know that lots of Jews did accept the gospel. You have Simeon at the temple. When he sees Jesus, he blesses him and he says, Luke chapter 2, this child will surely be the reason for the rise and the fall of all of Israel. This child is going to separate Israel into two groups. Those that find refuge and those who reject him and get broken. Simeon was already saying that. Simeon accepted him. Anna accepted him. John the Baptist said, look, there he is. That's the Lamb of God, the Son of God, the Lamb of God. He's the one that takes away the sins of the world. And then when Paul writes about his missionary journeys, sometimes, now Paul's habit, you remember this? Paul's habit was to always go to the synagogue first. I always go to the Jew first. And in some places like Ephesus and Corinth, he's well received in the synagogues. The Jews embrace his teaching. And the passage tells us that he stayed on there reasoning in the synagogues for a period of time. So a lot of Jews are receiving the gospel. But the Bible also says Paul went to other places, and as was his habit, he went to the synagogue first. But there were also times where he would get kicked out of the synagogue. And he would wipe the dust off his feet and says, I'm done with you. From now on, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. So we know in Paul's own evangelistic methods, Israel was split in half. Many rejected, but many embraced the gospel. That's just a little extra. I just felt like I wanted to make sure we understood what was happening in that century. So Paul knew full well Israel was divided into two groups. God had not given up or rejected Israel. Many of them were embracing the gospel. So in 56, he writes this letter extremely well informed. And the argument that Paul is building in this letter is to warn the Gentiles not to read the situation incorrectly and not to judge Israel wrongly, because you'll put yourself in jeopardy if you do that. You're on the same footing as them as long as you continue on the same path. That's the sermon, guys, and I want to share with you, I hope that you'll save these outlines, preserve these, because in the future, when you hear Romans 9, 10, or 11 being taught, I've given you the theme, the main important part. This is Paul's methodology. I've given you Paul's methodology, how he's writing his letter. If you should hear Romans 9, 10, or 11 taught differently, ask yourself, look at these notes, and when you hear something different, ask yourself, is this guy following the blue line backbone? Is this teacher following Paul's methodology? I've laid it out for you. Because if this individual is changing Paul's method, then he is also changing Paul's message. God bless you guys.